Welcome to lesson number 5 in our series entitled Let's Take Another Look, Passages of the Old Testament. Today we look at the Ten Commandments, and we're going to look at the Ten Commandments as found and recorded in Exodus chapter 20, although there is one particular time where I will reference the Ten Commandments as listed in Deuteronomy chapter 5, but primarily it's going to be Exodus chapter 20. But before we look specifically at the Ten Commandments, it's important to recognize that in that day and time they were revolutionary in what they did, at least in the known world around that time. There were other laws that would come out of the Ten Commandments that were also revolutionary as people began to understand and tried to understand and interpret, well, what does this particular commandment mean, and how do we understand that, and how we live that out in relationship to God and to each other. We know that of the 615 laws that were around at the time of Jesus, that some of them we also see found later on in Exodus and kind of Numbers, Leviticus in particular, and some of those that are there. But then there were also a bunch of laws that came out of the Ten Commandments as they tried to interpret the meaning for that day and that particular time. One of them, for example, is it had to do with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and a life for a life. And in our day and time, a lot of people have seen that as being kind of vengeful and harsh. In that day and time, it was a law of restraint. You could only take an eye for an eye. You could not take a life for an eye, for example. And when it came to the Ten Commandments later on, there would be questions about resting or not working on the Sabbath. And the question would come up, well, what constitutes work? How far can you walk before you're actually working? What are things that you are and are not allowed to do? And so those things kind of came out of it. But I want to say at the beginning that the heart of the Ten Commandments, while there's certainly behavior involved, and you'll hear me make this point more than once, while there's certainly behavior involved, the point of the Ten Commandments had to do with that obedience to and worship of God, and how they were going to live and pattern their lives in such a way that it demonstrated a way different from that of the world. Because not only were the laying out of these commandments in this particular way a kind of revolutionary, just even the worship of one God was revolutionary and unheard of in that day and time. All the other nations were polytheistic. And notice that even when it comes to the Hebrew people and how they dealt with things later for the next few hundred years, there was a belief that other gods existed and that they were real, but this had to do with who was the supreme God, who was the one God that was worthy of worship. And this understanding that Yahweh, that this God is above all the other gods. Laws of how to deal with each other, those laws, and we'll talk more about that relate to the commandments, that relate to our relationship with other people and our interactions there, were again avenues of demonstrating care for our neighbor, but also avenues, they were considered primarily as avenues of faithfulness to God. By acting in these ways, by holding to these commandments, by acting in these ways, you demonstrate that you belong to God, that you are part of the Hebrew people who are the representative people of God. Walter Brueggemann, who is somebody I've referenced before, a noted Old Testament scholar and who I've referenced on many different times, and I will throughout this study, this lesson as well, he says this about the commandments. He said, they are not just a set of good moral ideas. They contain conditions of viable human life, non-negotiable conditions rooted in God's own life and God's ordering of the world. So the Ten Commandments had to do with how God was going to order his people and the way in which they were going to operate individually and then as a society and then as a witness to the wider world. There's another aspect of the Ten Commandments before we get into the specific ones. It has to do with the fact that Moses, when he comes down from Mount Sinai, he has 2 tablets. And there have been over the years interpretations about what the 2 tablets were because they were inscribed and etched in stone. There's kind of one tradition that arose that said that some have said, well, it's just 5 and 5 and they just needed that space. Another said, no, on one tablet are the first 4 commandments: no gods before me, no idols or graven image, related to honor father and related to honoring the Sabbath day and keeping it holy, and wrongful use of the name of the Lord, that those relate primarily to our relationship with God, while the other 6 relate primarily to our relationship with each other. And so maybe 4 are on one and 6 on the other. But the interpretation that I have found most powerful and compelling is the idea that all 10 commandments were written on each tablet. So in other words, you had 2 copies of the 10 commandments. And the thought behind this, and why many theologians and scholars think that this was the case, is that in ancient times when a contract was made, it was made kind of like it is today. We have this today. You get a copy, each party gets a copy of the contract. If you go and buy a car, for example, you sign all that paperwork. They keep a copy of the contract so that they can make sure you're upholding your end. You keep a copy of the contract because it also outlines stipulations for the car company selling you the car. And so God is clear that God is the one initiating this covenant. God called Abraham. He was there with the people. God is the initiator of this covenant. And so the commandments that he's going to give are the contract, but really it's deeper. It's that covenant. It's that relationship that God says, even if you don't uphold your end of the deal, I'm going to uphold mine. It's what makes a contract different from a covenant. A contract is based on mistrust. You each get a copy so that you can hold the other accountable in case you mess up or violate that. A covenant still has the copies, but the covenant says this is based on a mutual relationship, ongoing relationship. And what God says is, even if you violate the covenant, I'm going to remain faithful to you. And we know that God's never going to violate his end of the deal itself. And so with this covenant, God initiates this relationship. God sets the terms of the covenant. He sets the parameters and what they mean. There's no negotiation with God. Well, God, how about this or how about that? No, there is just submission to God. God's the one who sets the conditions of the covenant. So one tablet belongs to the people, one tablet belongs to God. But where's God? God's with his people. God travels with his people. They had the tabernacle, the tent that was set up. He commands them to build the Ark of the Covenant. And what's kept in the Ark of the Covenant? The copies of these 10 commandments, the copies of that covenant. And so when the people themselves keep both copies, it's God's way of saying, I'm going to be with you. Wherever you go, there's where I'm going to be anyway. So you just hold on to both copies of the covenant, and they will remind you of the promise I've made to you and the promise you have made to me. And I just find something quite lovely and powerful in looking at that and thinking about that God tells the Hebrew people, you just keep both copies of the covenant because I'm going to be with you anyway. I will be your God, you will be my people, as he says. So we begin the looking at the 10 Commandments with a little preamble, if you will, where it says this: Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So what happens at the beginning of this covenant, at the beginning of these terms, if you will, God identifies formally who he is, his relationship, in his position in relationship to these people. Not just any God. He's not some random God that came upon the people. No, he's the God who is the Lord. He's the God who brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of freedom, out of the house of slavery. He is the God who freed them. And so God identifies himself as that primary party because God initiates the covenant, sets the parameters. So we begin with, you shall have no other gods before me. So he's saying from the outset, there is no other God. And remember, they believed other gods existed, but there would be no other God to whom you should have allegiance other than me. Not even I'm supposed to be first. I'm supposed to be the only God that you worship. In our day and time, when we look at that, we don't believe that there are other gods. They're only idols. We believe those things were made by humans, and then kind of given or interpreted or believed to have divine power. We don't believe there ever was an actual God called Baal or Baal or Ashur or Amun-Re, as I talked about in the study on the plagues, those sorts of things. People believe they were, but we believe there's only one true God that actually exists. Having said that, in our day and time, we do have idols, and we'll talk about idols with the next commandment too. We do have little g gods, if you will, that take our time and allegiance. And I've seen the following quote attributed to many different people, but it's a statement that says this. And I've seen it given in many different forms, so I'm going to give it this way. Whatever it is that you depend upon in this life to provide for you ultimate meaning, purpose, joy, and security is your God. Whatever you may proclaim with your lips, whatever it is that you look to, what is it that you look to provide meaning? What is it that you do to provide happiness? What is it that you depend upon to provide security? Some of those more common, quote, gods, little g gods that are really idols that we look of are things like money, power, status, the favor of other people, hobbies, sports, entertainers, politicians, whatever it is, where we look to them and we say, that's the source of our hope. That's what I look to have my allegiance, to have my attention, to have my devotion, to have my worship, if you will. And just about anything can be that little g God, can be that idol that you place above God if you find yourself looking to that thing for meaning and security in life. And God says, you shall have no other gods before me. If there's anything in this life that you put ahead of God, then it will not last. It will not provide what you want to, what you want it to provide. And only when you put that thing in submission to God and turn it over to the Lordship of Jesus Christ will it have any true and lasting meaning and importance. Only when it's in submission to God. And that's important for us to think about. What is it that you're tempted to place your allegiance and your trust in this life? If it's anything other than God, then you have to do away with it, or you put it in submission to the Lordship of Jesus Christ. The next then talks about this idol, or the traditionalists say graven image. And this is what God says. Verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of their parents to the third and fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. So this is the second commandment, but it kind of goes along with the first commandment, that we're not to make any idols, to bow down and worship anything other than God. And again, the traditional wording says graven image, but I think the word idol is a better one because it expands it a little bit. An idol is something that is man-made. It's something that is created, whether it's a physical object or an idea or a thought or a hobby or something like that we have an allegiance to. And that graven image, that idol, is something that is man-made, but we imbue with it or try to imbue with it the essence of a divine being, or we try to pretend it has divine power. There's a great story from Abraham, whose father Terah was a maker of idols, and he sold these idols. And Abraham, there's a legend that goes and says that Abraham went and destroyed all these different idols. And Terah comes back and sees all of his handiwork destroyed, and he says to Abraham, what happened? Why have you done this? And Abraham says, well, one of the gods got angry and just came in and destroyed everything and destroyed all the different idols. And Terah says, well, that's impossible because they don't have, these idols as contained here in these objects don't have any power. And Abraham says, well, if they don't have any power, then why are you making them and why are you worshiping them? You see, it was a way of saying they don't have any divine power in and of itself. The reason you wouldn't have an idol or a graven image, any man-made object, is because there is no representation of God that can contain the nature and the character and the essence of God. God is too vast. God is too great. God is too complex to be contained and to be able to contain in a box of an idol or of a graven image, or to be contained within the limitations or even our own thoughts or ideas. When Moses asked God there at the burning bush, "Who shall I tell the people has sent me?" God says, "I am." Or "I am who I am. I will do what I will do. I will be what I will be." In other words, if you want to know the essence of God, God says, "I'm the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob." But God doesn't say, "I'm the God of the Nile," or "I'm the God of the harvest," or whatever. He says, I am God. I contain all things. I am all in all. There's nothing that is sufficient to describe or to limit me. I am who I am, is what he says. There's no earthly image, nothing created by human hands that's sufficient to represent God. There's no stand-in for God, if you will. And God's power and essence certainly isn't going to be suffused into something that is man-made. And then he goes on and reminds them of the severity of this commandment and the negative and positive consequences. He says that he's a jealous God. So if you have these idols in place of him, he says he extends that punishment to the third and fourth generation of parents. But the depth of God's grace is that the grace goes to the 1,000th generation. And sometimes we get caught up in the punishment aspect of this statement, wondering how God could punish people for something his parents did. But there are really two ways of looking at it that I think kind of help us understand that. One way of looking at it is that God is not issuing a divine commandment as much as saying that when our lives are not on track with God as God intends, that the consequences of that disobedience to God, the consequences of those ungodly actions naturally extends beyond us. We are free to choose to act however we want to act. We are not free to choose the consequences of those decisions that we make. And so when we think about this iniquity of the parents extending to the third and fourth generation, for example, abusive parents tend to raise abusive children who abuse their children when they become parents. Other attitudes are handed down from generation and generation, and when those generational mindsets get handed down, they're very difficult to break. It can be done, and we see there are millions of examples where it has been done, but it's difficult. But the positive aspect of that as well. Stable parents, by and large, tend to raise stable children, and even if that child goes off the rails for a while, they know because of the example of love they've been given that they can come back to that and return to those roots that they had. And again, there are no guarantees. I've had friends that raised their kids as faithfully and lovingly as Becky and I tried to raise ours, and they went off the rails, sometimes for a period of time and sometimes, for many, 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 many years, and some of them still haven't come back to that stability of family. But as I tell young parents, when you raise your kids in a respective, loving, God-fearing, God-obedient environment, you increase the odds that your kids will reflect those values that you've taught, that will reflect that faith in Christ. And so part of it may be that God's just describing what are the consequences of that disobedience. When you do that disobedience, it tends to go generationally because patterns of ungodly behavior and thoughts and attitudes tend to be perpetrated for a few generations. But I really think that the best way of looking at it is looking at how God says, I punish the iniquity to the third and fourth, but I reward that obedience to the 1,000th. He's trying to talk about this very small number versus this magnificent number, 3 or 4 versus 1,000. The comparison between the limited temporary nature of God's mercy and the the temporary nature of God's punishment and the eternal nature of God's mercy. It's not mean to me as literal as God's God's punishment or God's mercy is 250 to 333 times greater than God's punishment. It's rather to say that is minor and temporary compared to the grace and mercy and for repentance of God. The next verse, in verse 7, goes on to say, "You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name." Now again, we've traditionally translated this commandment as "thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain." And even when we think about that, we tend to be fairly limiting in how we think about taking the Lord's name in vain, that we tend to think of it as swear words or cuss words, maybe using the name Jesus Christ as an expletive, maybe using swear words along with the name of God, and obviously things that I'm not going to say now, but tends to be more swearing or cussing. But I think that this way of looking at it, wrongful use of the name of the Lord, expands our understanding of it. It's more than just particular words that you use. It's the heart behind it. It's how you see God. It is how you view God as a means to an end, or that end itself. It's, do you use God for your own purposes and your own wants and desires, or do you see God as the one who is supreme, and we submit ourselves to him? And just a couple of quick examples. I heard a preacher pray one time at a football game, "Lord, we pray for victory for our team, and we pray for safe travel for the other team as they go home tonight." Now, I remember sitting there listening to it, kind of chuckling in one sense, but it really, the more I thought about it, I got a little irritated because it was an offensive thing to say. It was presuming to use the name of God to ask for God's favor among one particular group of people, a football team of all things, over somebody else, and that somehow invoking that name of God meant that God cared more about that one group of people than he did about someone else. It's perfectly appropriate at a prayer for a sporting event to say, "Lord, I pray for safety for teams. We pray that there'll be a good spirit of competition, a spirit of goodwill in the stands and on the field. And Lord, we pray for safe travels for those going home." It's another to say, "Lord, I'm praying to you for victory for my team. And for safe travel for the other." Like, "Lord, I'm asking you to provide victory for mine, to favor me and my people over these other people." I heard a woman one time talking about her son getting a soccer scholarship. And the son had not initially gotten the scholarship, but one of the young men who had received the scholarship but hadn't started school yet had broken his leg, and he was unable to take the scholarship. And the woman was praising God that God, quote, had worked it out so that her son was able to get a scholarship. And what got me about that was that she was so self-centered in her concern or thinking about her son that not once in the midst of this did she express any sympathy for the young man who had broken his leg. And in fact, she interpreted this young man breaking his leg as something God did so that her son could then get the scholarship. And she praised God that things had worked out so well for her son, not acknowledging that God would not break somebody's leg. If God wanted her son to have the scholarship, give it to him in the first place. But this idea that God caused direct harm to somebody else for the purpose of it working out for her son again, that's a wrongful use. It's presuming to use the name of the Lord for our own selfish ambition, for our own selfish purposes, our own selfish wants and desires. Whenever we invoke the name of God to justify ungodly words, ungodly actions, ungodly thoughts, we make a wrongful use of the name of the Lord. It goes far beyond swear words. Walter Brueggemann, who I told you I was going to continue to quote, puts it this way, and I think this is great. Misusing God's name is the violation to make Yahweh, who is the ultimate end, into a means for some other end. In other words, Yahweh is not the end in of himself, the object of our worship. Yahweh is a tool through which we pray to get what we want. And that is not the purpose of faith at all. Now, before we move to the fourth one, about the Sabbath day, I want us to look at these just a brief glance back at these first three commandments. No gods before me, no idols or no graven image, no wrongful use. Walter Brueggemann, again, to quote him, says, all three concern seductive ways in which the God of the Exodus is diminished or trivialized. And I think that's just a really strong quote, because under the guise of invoking the name of the Lord and the authority of the Lord, if we're not careful, we actually can trivialize the name of the Lord. And while that is a serious offense now as it was then, we have to remember that we have to remember the context in which the commandments were given in the first place. It's after the Exodus, but before they enter into the land of Canaan, the promised land. God was teaching the people of Israel how to be a people, how to be a nation that followed him, that lived according to his laws, that sought to worship him and be his representative people in this world. The supreme God of all, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who delivered them to freedom, is not a God to be trivialized or diminished for our own selfish purposes. Rather, God is the ultimate end of all things in himself. God is the object of our worship, and all the things of this earth, all of our wants and desires, are means and avenues of serving God. God is not an avenue of serving our wants and desires, if that helps. And I like here how he also kind of gives a little bit longer quote that I'll give. He said, the truth of the matter is that the biblical God is not, quote, user-friendly. And he goes on to talk about some different temptations and critiques. He said the, quote, liberal temptation is to diminish the role of God, either to remove God from the public sphere of life and leave God for interpersonal matters only, or to make God an object of adoration rather than the subject who can do anything. And so we kind of put God off to the side as just one little aspect, is what he's getting at, of our lives instead of the totality of our being. He says one aspect of this signal of such reductionism is the slogan that, quote, God has no hands but ours, as if somehow God cannot work outside of us. He says the conservative reaction and this conservative temptation is the projection of this settled sovereign God who, in fact, is not operative as an apolitical character, as in the drama of the Exodus, but is only a set of fixed propositions that give certitude and stability. In other words, that to try to limit God to this series of propositions, and even just the Ten Commandments itself, a series of propositions, instead of is the supreme God who is continually active and working and revealing himself in new and magnificent ways in our world day in and day out. God is more than just a set of beliefs. God is a person, supreme, and the supreme person and being who guides our lives in all things. He says either way, in our shared theological failure with nerve, if we fall prey to these temptations, we end with a God very unlike the God who makes this self-disclosure. What type of God? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the God who freed you, the God who's initiating this covenant, the God who will continue to be with you, the God who's giving you these commandments as ways and means of obedience to me, ways of God, he says, and as ways of ordering your life in relationship to each other as the nation is obedient, God says, to me. We move on to the next part, which the fourth commandment, which says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male, your female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and consecrated it. Well, the rationale given for observing a Sabbath is that God rested on the Sabbath day and thus consecrated it, made it holy. Of course, God didn't have to rest. God didn't require rest on that seventh day. But I think it's a way of recognizing that the biblical writers had of recognizing that God created us, and that there is always room and time, even in creation, there's always room and time for rest. We as human beings are not designed physically, emotionally, or spiritually to be on the go 24/7. We need that time of rest of body, mind, and spirit in order to be the people God is calling us to be fully to fully belong to God and do that, we need those times. We need those times for rest of the body. We need for those times of reflection and those times of prayer. We need those times to take care of ourselves, body, mind, and spirit. Now, one little kind of point I want to bring up is that if we look at Deuteronomy 5, which is the other time where we have the recording of the Ten Commandments, the reason given then for observing the Sabbath is that they were slaves in Egypt and the Lord freed them. So the Sabbath rest then can also be understood as the fact that they are a free people. And they are not slaves. Slaves don't get any rest. Slaves don't get any days off. But as a free people who belong to God, who were created by God and are part of God's creation, we are to rest. We are to not do anything that would be work. In Deuteronomy 5:15, this is how he puts it. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Well, when we think about it in modern times, how are we to understand this admonition of a time in which we do live in a 24/7 world where, as a contrast to some of us who grew up were on Sundays when stores weren't open? We live in a 24/7 world where stores are open during the worship hour as well. How do we understand the Sabbath day? How do you understand if you're somebody who has to work on Sunday? If you have those types of jobs where you have to do that, what would we consider a Sabbath in our Christian context? And then to kind of throw an extra little monkey wrench into it, while Jesus had different things to say at different times about the Ten Commandments, the Sabbath day is the only one that he didn't affirm in its purely traditional understanding or didn't make even more restrictive by talking about the heart of the matter than the commandment already was on the surface. We see Christ himself. He plucked grain on the Sabbath to eat. He healed on the Sabbath, and on several occasions seemed to violate the strict observance of the Sabbath, and he even at one point says that the Sabbath is made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So whereas the other aspects he talks about, he even interprets it, if anything, more strictly, because he said it's not just the behavior, it's the heart and the attitude behind it. He says not only don't commit adultery, just don't even be lustful. So it's not only the act of adultery, is Jesus talking about, it's the attitude and the lusting after somebody in our heart. That's an example where Jesus, if anything, makes it a stronger commandment than we even see in the Ten Commandments. Here he seems to say that the Sabbath is meant for us to give us that time of rest, but we shouldn't be so legalistic in it when we're figuring out how to observe it. And I don't think Jesus wasn't doing away with the Sabbath. Jesus worshiped on the Sabbath. He went, as was his custom, to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. But if we're not careful in our day and time, we can fall into kind of a legalism on the Sabbath, maybe even more so than some of the others. For example, my wife Becky enjoys working in the yard. She enjoys putting in the plants and fertilizing, if there are bushes that need to be trimmed, those types of things. And so for her, it's relaxing. It takes her mind off other things. So if she happens to do that on a Sunday, is she breaking the commandment of Sabbath? It's not really work for her. It involves physical exertion, but it's not work. It rejuvenates her. It rejuvenates her spirit. I don't enjoy those things, and so it's work for me. It's not restful in body or spirit to me. But let's say, what if I had a big yard and I have a riding mower, and I enjoy riding on that mower, and I enjoy getting out there and finding a time, finding it very relaxing where I don't have to think about anything, maybe for a couple of hours, anything more complicated than keeping a straight line. Then it's not. Then that may not be work for me. It may be something that is restful in spirit for me. And this admonition of Jesus that the Sabbath is made for the man and not man for the Sabbath, where we see how Jesus himself healed and did acts of mercy on that day. He plucked grain on the Sabbath. Those things remind us that while these commandments, the Sabbath commandment and the others, have a behavioral component, we always have to go back to what I've already said a couple of times already. The commandments were an avenue of worship to God, a demonstration that the people lived by way of obedience to God and allegiance to God, not to the things of this world. And so we have to be careful with this commandment and the others, not get caught up in the legalisms, but to think about the heart of that and the heart of that understanding, what it means to worship. I would say in our day and time, one of the values of taking that Sabbath is to remind ourselves that we are not indispensable. The world existed before we got here. The world will go on after we are gone. We need, for our own physical and emotional and spiritual and mental health, we need times of rest. We need times of disengagement. We need those specific times where we gather with God's people to worship, because that gathering together as a community of faith to worship is not something that's duplicated at any other time in any other aspect of this world. So we need to remember that Sabbath and honor it and keep it holy. We need those times of rest for our own rejuvenation of body, mind, soul, and spirit. The next passage goes on and moves us more into that relationship with each other. Honor your father and mother so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord is giving you. Notice here there's a condition. Honor so that. Why would you have to honor so that those days would be long? It's because the honoring of the parents kept the connection with what God did in Egypt. The honoring of parents denotes the importance of the Exodus, to pass that down from generation to generation, to pass down the teachings of God, to pass down these laws, to pass down that worship of God, to honor. In the immediate time, it was to honor what the parents had been through, these parents who had endured hundreds of years and generations of slavery, to honor what the parents had been through and the suffering they endured, and then to honor what God had done through them, to not discard or throw away those parents when they were too old to work, too weak to work, or even to care for themselves, to honor those parents, to continue to take care for them, to recognize that when the parents get where they can't take care of the child or take care of themselves, then the children have the responsibility to take care of the parents. One of the ways that you honor. Well, how do we honor our parents today? Does it mean strict obedience to what our parents tell us, even though we may be adults? In a culture where multiple generations do not usually live together and may even live far apart from each other, how do we honor that father and mother today if we don't see each other? How does that honoring father and mother change as we leave, as we get older, as we age? What does it mean to honor your father and mother if maybe you're one of your parents or both of your parents were maybe abusive, or maybe you grew up in an unloving or harsh environment? And so what does it mean? In that day and time, that biological generational lineage was everything to them. That's how they passed it down. It was an honor and shame culture. You brought shame upon yourself if you did anything to dishonor your parents. And it also impacted your ability down the line to inherit what that was, to pass on, to inherit and then to pass on what you yourself had been given. By honoring father and mother, that family line continued generation after generation, biologically and in spirit. Again, we live in a very different culture, and we live in a culture in which respect for elders, many times you outlive your utilitarian usefulness, and we try to discard you. And in our day and time, honoring fathers and mothers can be honoring our elders too, and recognizing the valuable contributions. They're recognizing that all that they have done, recognizing not only what they have done, but who they are, recognizing their value to God, recognizing and respecting what they did, recognizing them as individual whole human beings with all their own faults and failures and strengths and wonderful things. And a way of showing obedience to God is to treat those elders, to treat our mother and father with respect, even if they may have not treated you with respect. The next one goes on and says, do not murder. It's expressing the importance of human life, a reminder that all life belongs to God. And it's not our right to take away that which belongs to God, which God has given to us. We should not try to take away. Only God should be able to give and take life. But again, it's another one that the interpretation of it has led to many different ways of justifying the technical breaking of this commandment. Sometimes we simplify it by saying thou shalt not kill, but really the word is murder. Do not murder. So the question is, if you kill in a time of war, soldiers kill in a time of war, is it murder? Is there some killing that may take place in a war that's justified, while other types of killing, particularly maybe of innocent civilians, may be considered murder, while killing in self-defense or killing in a times of war may not be considered murder? Those are questions that have been asked all over the centuries. We look not too long after this, after the people wandered in the wilderness and they went into the land of Canaan. God told them, you're going to encounter different tribes. You've got to battle these different tribes. You're going to have to kill people to conquer these tribes. And so they clearly didn't think that the prohibition of murder applied to any type of killing out at all. One of the ways that they looked at it in that day and time was that this prohibition against murder didn't apply to people outside the covenant people of Israel, but it had to do with their relationship with each other. The murder, the violence perpetrated by somebody else within the people of Israel itself. But also, that's the only way that they could justify killing of all these different tribes, and sometimes even where God tells them to kill the women and the children. Others interpret eye for an eye restraint as saying that taking a life didn't break this commandment if you were retaliating a life for a life. Now, one of the interesting things is that Jesus did away with this justification, didn't he? He did away with the justification of an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for a life. Although Christians still use that as rationalization to justify taking a life. We have to go back again that Jesus is talking about the motivations of the heart, and what do the motivations of the heart lead us to do. And I think we have to always interpret these commandments in light of the greatest commandment that Jesus tells us is the commandment of love, to love God with all of our hearts, mind, soul, and strength, to love our neighbor as ourselves. My own personal way when I look at it and I interpret it that the taking of any life is against the will of God. And I have made a pledge not to take a human life in my life. Fortunately, I've never been faced with that decision of whether I would have to kill somebody else to defend a member of my family or to defend myself. And though there may be times in which it's necessary, I would have to look at that in that day and time. But we have to look at that and say, are there times when maybe taking of a human life would be necessary or justified, even if it is not the ideal circumstances? And sometimes there are times where there's just no good solutions. There's no good answer to this question of what it means to kill, to take another life, what it means to murder. And we just have to do with guidance from the Holy Spirit into prayer and discernment, if we're facing in those times, to think about how we would respond to those instances. In that day and time, do not murder referred to that taking of a human life of another person. And usually it would be to justify something that you wanted to do, to justify your own wants and desires, or to explain away your own anger. That murder, we know that murder breaks down the bonds of trust in society, and we're going to see that with these others as well. Do not commit adultery. In that original meaning, in that original day, adultery had the dimension of kind of stealing somebody else's property, stealing another man's property. And again, as with the others, the violation breaks down the bonds of trust within the family relationship and within the social relationships of the larger community. As we think about that and understand that covenant of marriage as being between a husband and a wife, that adultery breaks that covenant between that husband and wife, and it also breaks that covenant in another marriage. It's clear that adultery doesn't mean just having only one wife, at least not in biblical times, because in biblical times kings and others continued to have multiple wives, and many times they even had concubines. Adultery has to do with the relationship with another man's wife, or that's how it was in that day and time. It was thought more about that, or the relationship of one who is bound within the covenant of marriage having a physical sexual relationship with somebody outside the bonds of that marriage covenant. And if you look at it, it kind of relates close to covetousness, doesn't it? Although we'll look at that in a broader environment in a minute. We also have to remember that in this day and time, in ancient times, marriages were arranged. And so there wasn't so much the consideration of love as that primary motivation. Though the Old Testament clearly talks of love. He talks about love of husband and wife, and some of those particular ones who loved each other, like the love of Jacob for Rachel, where he's willing to work for 14 years to be able to fully have her. Another aspect of adultery, just in terms of how it worked, was that passing down that biological generational lineage was very important. And so adultery, if it was the wife committing the adultery, or a man committing adultery with another man's wife, you see it could have implications for the potential interruption of a man's biological lineage. And that was of critical importance too, because they didn't look at it in quite the same way. In our day and time, adultery has a different context, but it has to do mainly with the violation of those covenantal bonds of marriage. And even if one of the parties isn't married, you still entered into that breaking of the bonds of a committed covenantal marital relationship that one or both parties, both people violate. And so it breaks down the bonds of trust. It creates bitterness and anger in the midst of that, and it's the breaking of those covenantal bonds of marriage. The next has to do with stealing. Stealing, again, like these others, it's a threat to the social order. It breaks down trust, has a negative impact on the ability of another person to provide for his family, because especially in that day and time, people didn't have a lot of stuff, and so to steal something that belonged to somebody else was of great concern, because it could have a direct impact on the ability of that family even to survive. It breaks down the bonds of trust. We're not sure who committed that act, and so we become suspicious of others. Stealing has, again, like adultery, a covetous dimension, because you are taking from somebody else that which belongs to them, that you want, but for which you are not willing to work. We move on, and thou shalt not bear false witness. We again tend to send that into thou shalt not lie, but it's deeper than that. Bear false witness goes back to that courtroom trial idea. False witness, like adultery and stealing, breaks down the bonds of trust. So it's harmful to personal relationships. It's harmful to the social order. If you can't trust what another person says or does, then there's no basis for a relationship. One of the things that our kids knew and understood was that one of the rules of the household that you absolutely did not violate was this rule on lying, on bearing false witness. Because what we would say to our kids, if you lie to us, then we can't believe anything you say. We can't trust you to go and do anything. And so in the midst of that, that bearing false witness might be bearing false witness against a neighbor. It may be bearing false witness in the sense that you're lying about something that you did. But what happens is we know those people that we cannot trust. We know that we can't hold on to them to tell the truth or to keep their word. And then those people, even if we like them personally, we cannot trust them. And where there is no trust, there's no real basis for a true, lasting relationship. And then also bearing false witness, which is something we often do for our own protection, to protect ourselves or maybe to protect somebody else. That's unacceptable, because it puts our private emotions or motive or intentions above that of the social good. It protects ourselves, or it's attempts to protect ourselves at the expense of that obedience to God. And neither one of those ultimately last. Then we move on to covetousness, and God says this: you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female slave, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, when we think about covetousness, we tend to think of covetousness as being this. You know, I wish I had what he or she has. But it goes far deeper than that. There's nothing wrong with saying, I bet it would be nice to have that kind of car. I bet it would be nice to have, to be able to take that really nice trip that my friends just took. I bet it would be nice to live in that house. I bet there's a level of comfort there. I bet it would be nice to have that job, to make that kind of money. There's nothing wrong with looking and saying, I bet that would be nice. Those would be good avenues of enjoyment of life. Covetousness moves beyond that. It moves beyond just looking at somebody else's possessions. It involves allowing those possessions to interfere in your relationship with that person. You interfere with the social order. Covetousness, when we covet, it causes negative feelings towards that other person. And it makes that possession, it makes that thing the focus of our attention. And it turns not only that object into objects, or objectifying it, it turns people into objects. When we covet, we know the temptation. If we covet something, we look at what somebody else has and we become jealous. We then try to come up with reasons why that person has it and we don't. And usually when it does that, we think ourselves better. We go, well, that person just got lucky, or they had it given to them. They didn't really work to earn it. Maybe they stole to get it. They used dishonest means, and I'll never have those things because I would never respond in that type of way. So it impugns the motives and the heart and the character of another person. Instead of recognizing that all of us have different types of gifts, all of us enjoy different types of blessings, all of us have different types of resources, and somebody might have a particular type of resource in greater measure or degree than we do, but it doesn't mean that we are without. When we covet, we ignore or diminish what God has given to us. And instead of having an attitude of thanksgiving that says, God, thank you for all that I have, we say, God, what you've given to me is not enough. I want more, and I want that. And we also have to remember that while we might be envious of what somebody else has, there's somebody looking at all that we have that's so much more than what they have. And they may be saying those same things about us that we're saying about that person who we are coveting. And so it interferes with our relationship with each other. Instead of having gratitude for all that God has given to us, it diminishes and trivializes what it is, the blessings that we enjoy. And we all have to admit that we've been given an awful lot. So when we think about the Ten Commandments on the whole, they are multi-layered. I've just scratched the barest surface of the meaning of these commandments and possible meanings of these commandments. Because the Ten Commandments are both ancient, they had a context for their day and time, but they're also modern because we adhere to them today. They date back 3,000 years, and yet they still form a good part of the basis of our own social order in our secular life and in the governmental civil society as well. We still have punishments for those things. And even if there aren't legal consequences, we understand that there are moral and other types of consequences. Many of our laws revolve around violations of these commandments in one way or another. In that day and time, they were an explicit part of the covenantal relationship of God. God says, I'm teaching you how to be, you are my people. I'm going to teach you how to be my people. This is how you live. This is what it means to be part of me, to be my people. You observe these commandments. These commandments, God says, are setting you apart from other nations, and you are to observe them as avenues of obedience and allegiance to me. And certainly they had an individual component because each person had to adhere to these things on their own, but primarily they were to be understood within the context of the formation of the people of Israel and what it meant for them to be God's representative people in this world. And for those of us who are Christian, they continue, and those who are Jewish as well, they continue to be part of the way that we demonstrate our allegiance to God, to be that public witness in a world that encourages us to follow other idols, of our allegiance and obedience to God and God's continuing activity in deep involvement in this world. The Ten Commandments, and indeed the overall law itself, set the parameters of the covenant, the conditions of the covenant. They're not things that we set. They are things that God told us and we submit to them. They contain calls to obedience. They contain promise. They contain accountability. They contain the requisite blessings. And they demonstrate, and we then and now, to those around us that we belong to God and to no other. That God is one, and that God is supreme. Still today, we see the Ten Commandments as avenues of that type of obedience and faithfulness to God. We pledge to live in a way that is different from that of the world. We observe the Ten Commandments today to show God's ongoing power, presence, and activity and blessing in this world. And we continue to do that this day and forevermore as we seek to be obedient to God, to be His disciples, and to demonstrate to the world who we love and who loves us. I thank you for taking this time today to, and if you have feedback, I invite you, please write a comment. Please let me know who you are as you are watching. I'd love to know that. I see raw numbers, but I would love to know who it is that's watching. I know that they're members of the church that I'm serving at this time. As I look at some of those numbers days later that I know are watching, but I'd love to know exactly who it is. Some of you will sometimes say to me at church or at another time, "Hey, Brother Chris, I went and I listened to this or that lesson." But I'd love for you to write those comments. Offer me some feedback. Ask questions. Make comments, because there may be some of you who came across this and you don't have any connection to the church. You may even been exploring in your faith and you haven't, and you have questions. You may have comments. You may disagree with me, and that's okay as well. I would love to engage in that conversation with you. So leave a comment. Leave a name of who you are if you feel comfortable doing that. And let me know of ways that I can continue and things that I can do better to help you gain a deeper understanding and help you of faith and help you grow in your walk with Christ. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to being with you in our next lesson. God bless you and have a wonderful day.